outsourced billing. Who's in-house in the room? All right, a bunch, and everybody else is outsourced. Anybody have no idea? All righty, good. I'll talk a little bit about kind of policy issues around billing and collection, a little bit about being in or out of network, a little bit about if you should give taxpayers and residents a break or not, and then a little bit about how the two health information exchanges in the state might be able to help us out. On top of that, we were a little worried there might not be 90 minutes of content here, so feel free to stop me and ask me any questions about anything. And if we seem to be doing really bad on time, I'm going to talk to Tim Dienst and ask him questions, and then I'm going to ask Randy Lesher in the back to not actually agree with what Tim Dienst says, and that should help us fill a good chunk of our time this morning. So those are the overall objectives. You're supposed to tell folks what you're going to tell them, then tell them, then remind them what you told them is the educational rule. But what we're really doing today, and my slide advancer just left the room. It's the button here for that. Oh, there it is. All right. The real thing though is, so he sent the ambulance out, it does great things, it saves somebody's life, but then we send a bill, and has anybody noticed that your impression of the organization perhaps changes in between the saving their life part and the bill arriving at their mailbox part? Yes, so that's kind of a common theme. And so that bill though is super important, because how we process that bill and get the money in the door is really critical to the financial health of our organizations. And that bill also leaves a long-lasting impression with our customers. And I assume everybody's heard the kind of statement that if you have a happy customer, how many people are they going to tell about their great experience with your service? Yeah, not many. I'm seeing a bunch of signs that look like this for those of you online. But yeah, probably not that many. If they have a bad experience or if they're completely shocked by the ambulance bill, how many people do they tell? And they do that usually on a social media platform, and you know, there's lots of good fun that comes along with that. So clearly how we handle this billing piece is really one of the lasting impressions we will leave with our community. And I think from my perspective, especially as a special district, we just asked a question to the voters in our fire district a couple weeks ago. Hey, how do you feel about us borrowing 20-some million dollars over the next 25 years? And if all they remember is that irritating ambulance bill, that makes really getting positive answers to those requests harder. So we definitely want to keep that in mind as we go along. So that's what we're really going to try to parse out of things here. So anybody taking an economics course? Anybody? Anyone want to admit to it? All right. All right. So this is actually all of economics on this graph right here. Yes, sir.
Just so that you know, the people can just see what that.
I was wondering about that.
So you might want to point out what the bottom things are.
So they can't see what?
So it looks like the technical issue we seem to be dealing with is the yellow highlight border is the only portion of the screen that everyone online can see. Is that correct, Tim?
Yes.
So give us just a second to try and correct that.
Hit escape.
Hit escape. It's got to be the answer. After that, we're going to reboot.
Okay, I've hit escape. Multiple. Do I stop share and then redo it?
Yeah, I would try that real quick. And now I'm big, so I should back up.
And when you share, just share the Zoom rather than this.
Yes, try that. Let's see if that helps.
Yes.
There you go.
I hear from the remote reaches that we are victorious. Economics, it's all right here. So if you have ever taken an economics class, you will spend an entire semester in this graph. This is the law of supply and demand. The one thing that you can take to cocktail parties about economics is there's only one thing called a law, and this is it. Everything else is theory, and they're not sure. But this is the part that tends to prove itself over and over again over time. So on this graph, on that line going up and down, the y-axis with the letter P, that's price. The horizontal or the x-axis going across, that's the quantity that a person might want. If I am the buyer of something, I am the curve that runs from the P down to the word demand. And that is what's known as the demand curve. If I am the producer of something, I live on the other curve, which is called the supply curve, and that runs from the lower corner there at the intersection up to the word supply. And so what price something is and how much of something gets made and how much folks want really all lives on this curve. And that sounds like super theoretical, right? So you're all like, yeah, but it's two lines on a chalkboard looking thing. So a concrete example, it's almost the holidays. Is everybody thinking of buying gifts? Anybody have kids? Anybody have grandkids?
Yeah.
All right. So that means you're interested in spending money. Here I have two examples. These are both from the Lego Corporation. The item on the left-hand side is your Jedi Interceptor set, Lego Star Wars. It goes for 24 bucks. There are a lot of them available at the Target across the street from where we are right now, I would guess. The one on the right is the Ultimate Millennium Falcon. It goes for $800. And it has a few more pieces than the other one. So let's just do a quick survey. If you had, say, a couple of grandkids, how many of the one on the left are you willing to buy? Maybe two. All right. All right. So how many of the one on the right are you willing to buy? 0. Okay. So let's change it up a little bit. If I'm Lego and I got to make sure that everybody gets what they want for the holidays, you know, and I'm a fine, kind of Copenhagen-based corporation, how many of the one on the left am I going to make? A whole bunch. And how many of the one on the right am I going to make? Probably not all that many. You're going to have to order that one online, or you're going to have to go to a Lego store to get that one. It's not going to be available at your local Walmart. So going back to our curve, give me an advance. There we go. So on the demand curve, the price of the small Lego set is pretty low. So the quantity demanded is going to be pretty high. So that puts me in that lower corner where the Q and the word demand is. On the other hand, that set on the right is a super high priced item, which means the quantity that is going to be demanded is going to be pretty low. And then that also plays through on the supply curve. We're probably not making a lot of the super expensive ones, but we're probably going to try to make a whole bunch of the inexpensive ones. So everybody got the general idea of the supply and the demand curve. All right, well then let's talk about, other way, there we go.
There.
Okay, so now let's talk about things that we know about. So, for the ambulance item, are there a lot of ambulances or just a few ambulances that kind of hang around in the state of Colorado? There are a decent amount, there's, 200 services, 750, 800 ambulances, is just my kind of off the cuff guess. So that means they're probably in more demand and probably priced a little lower. Is that a fair statement than the counterpoint? And is there anybody from the air ambulance world in the room? So. All right, I don't have to verify empirically then that the thing on the right probably costs a little more. And so how many of those are in the state?
Doesn't.
Yeah, not quite as many. And what kind of price point are we looking at in comparison to an ambulance? Yeah, probably a lot more. So it does kind of play through in our world, but I bet a bunch of you are kind of thinking, yeah, but I don't really know the price of either of those two things, right? And do our customers know the price of either of those two things? Why don't they? Because we didn't tell them. That's one answer. Any other ideas? And who pays for these things?
Nobody.
Nobody. Not, and as my 15-year-old would say, that's fair. If somebody does pay for it, who is it? Taxpayers pay a chunk of it. And then who else pays for it? Yeah. We'll just call them other third parties, right? So we've got some stuff going on probably in our pricing world that are not quite as simple as buying a Lego set at Target. Is that a fair statement? So, all right, so what we need to know then is this is a demand curve that's doing something funny. It's gone from kind of a 45-degree angle to something that looks closer to straight up and down, right? And if it's straight up and down, and this one isn't quite there because it's, we're not sure it's theoretically possible to have a straight up and down demand curve, but what that would mean is the demand of how much people want is always the same. And you can charge whatever you want for it. So is the demand for ambulance service pretty flat? Does it change a lot? Does it change a little? How's it going in all of your organizations? It's going up over time. And then as it goes up, are you adding supply as well? Who's adding ambulances into their systems as demand goes up? See, at least one. There's always one or two of them. Very good. Yeah, so if you got paid more for that thing, would you produce more of them? Not necessarily. Why is that?
You have adequate supply to meet the demand, you don't need more supply.
So that kind of indicates we're probably not changing supply very much. And our demand is changing some, but not a ton. So what that probably, and here on this graph, it just essentially shows that we would at a higher price point produce more things than at a lower price point. So we are probably closer to, if they don't know the price, and if the demand doesn't change all that much, we're probably in a position where we can charge anything we want, right?
Yeah. We
maybe.
may not get paid it, but we can charge it.
Within reason.
Within, so the comments in the room are, we can charge it. We might not get it. It needs to be within reason. So, all right, let's put all that stuff into the mix then. And understand that what we're doing in healthcare in general is probably not exactly this pure supply and demand thing. It's got a lot of weird complexities coming into it, like who's paying and what they know. It doesn't really flow classically like supply and demand does. So overall, it's just kind of weird. Is everybody cool with that? All right, Ruben.
I have a question, I guess, that when you're looking at this economic model, it's kind of different than most economic models in that if I want to sell you a Lego set, you don't want to pay the price I'm asking for the Lego set. And I say, all right, well then go get your kid a Care Bear for Christmas and they're not getting Legos.
I see.
But I don't have the option to refuse to provide you ambulance service if you don't want to pay my bill for your 911.
So for those of you online, the enlightened Mr. Farnsworth in the room had the interesting observation, going back to our healthcare model here, that if I'm buying a Lego set, I can choose to buy it or not. If I'm buying an ambulance, I kind of don't have a choice. I'm kind of getting the one that somebody else is choosing for me. And I probably don't have any ability to shop for that on price.
Well, but I think.
And what else?
I think you're twisting the way I'm saying it. I'm
Okay,
looking at it from the other
I'm just
perspective.
trying to clarify for the people
Oh,
online.
yeah,
So.
yeah. To me, I'm looking at it the other way. Yes, you don't, if I call for an ambulance in Crestview, Colorado,
Uh-huh.
I have one option that's gonna show up.
Mhm.
But conversely, if I call 911 and say, I need an ambulance, I have severe chest pain and I'm dizzy. However, I will not be paying a $1,500 ambulance bill. Are you going to decline to respond?
Well, interestingly enough, I will, so again, to reiterate, so the other point that Ruben has made is that the service is provided. And we're not gonna refuse to provide that service, regardless of if the customer chooses to pay or not. Is that an
Yeah.
accurate representation? Well, golly, this doesn't sound anything like that super easy curve that's all over economics. That's like a law, does it? So I think you're totally onto something there. So, all right, well, understanding we have all these things that don't work like that system should work, how should we price our thing? So let's, here are the general steps. This also comes with, I paid at the time, it was around the turn of the century, $35,000 for my master's degree. It came with 5, maybe 10 one-liners that were really the entire value of the education. This is one of them. The first step in knowing the price is to know your costs. The rule there and the MBA one-liner is, if you lose $1 on every sale, are you going to make it up on volume? You are not. You are just going to lose more money. So the idea is understand what it costs you to provide the actual service is really the first step in the overall process. The next step after that, and this is pricing anything, right? It's like if I'm Lego, I'm asking myself all these same questions. How much does a 248 brick set cost me to produce, right? So it's a similar question, no matter what. So the second question is the goal. What are we trying to do when we are selling ambulance service? Who here is trying to cover the entire cost of their ambulance operation through the price they charge and the amount they recover? Anyone? How about you, Tom? Can you help me out back there?
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, so sounds like one of the goals could be paying for the cost of ambulance service. And there's a whole sub-tier question there about what actually is the cost of ambulance service. But what are you actually trying to do? I can tell you in our organization, well, we're trying to offset some of the costs of some of our EMS activity. We, however, are a 400 transport a year operation. So we make maybe $300,000 a year in ambulance revenue. So I am not going to pay for the entire cost of my operation with those kind of numbers. So as a public agency, we use a chunk of our property taxes to offset that cost. Who else is in the same boat in the room? Probably a bunch of folks, right? Yeah, so understanding what you're trying to achieve. And then, yeah, let's go back to that question again. Who's the customer? Is it the person on the stretcher in the back of the ambulance?
Yes.
It is. Who else is it?
It's the payer.
It's the payer. Who are they?
It varies.
That varies, but we have names for them like, you know, the government, those people, those mean insurance companies. But yeah, it's Medicare, Medicaid, Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Healthcare, et cetera. So yeah, all of those payers in there. Who else?
Watch security of when if they have an emergency, they got to call.
So that's kind of like the general public that you serve. So, okay, that's a good list. Anybody got any other candidates for customers?
Major community partners, so the hospitals, health department.
Right.
Entities you work with, that they supplement your revenue stream.
Right. And we were sitting around telling some stories last night. And of course, hospitals don't have any like interest in what the ambulance charges, right? I mean, no person in a hospital has ever said, it's cool, it'll be free, or they charge too much, or they charge too little. So yeah, they definitely play a role as well. So, okay. And then the last item on the punch list is really, well, what's the value proposition? Why would you buy ambulance service? To live, man, to live is the answer in the room. Any good answers online? No, I think that's a good one. Yeah, what you're offering people is really a way out of their bad day, right? And it's a way out of their bad day by providing medical services that are probably covered by their insurance if they have it. So you're essentially offering them a healthcare service that helps get them through whatever episode they're having, and really helps get their care started before they get to the hospital, right? So any other ways anybody would describe that? Is that worth selling? Sure. And it comes with highly trained professionals who are really nice and sympathetic. The one thing I've learned in my career too, it should also come with a blanket, because you will get like 0 complaints about the mean paramedic. You will get hundreds about not having a blanket and a pillow. Has anybody else experienced that? And there isn't any way to justify not having a blanket and a pillow in my experience. So yeah, what is the value proposition is that piece. So let's dive a bit more into this understanding the costs part. So who was around when the Medicare program instituted their negotiating rulemaking process? That was around that turn of the 21st century. I know a few of you in the room were around at that point in time. So what has Medicare kind of always told us about how they view the world that we continue to ignore? I'll just add that little editorial comment. They have said all along that they are willing to pay the incremental cost of ambulance service. They have also probably said all along, going back to negotiated rulemaking, that the availability of ambulance service, or the readiness cost, is a local responsibility. Yet we continue to complain as an industry that Medicare is not paying the full cost of readiness. And if you ask the people in the cubicles in Baltimore, they will say, yes, we've been telling you that for quite some time, a number of decades now. What is a readiness cost?
While you're waiting for a call.
While you're waiting for a call. So tell me those kinds of expenses. Eric had some on his slides.
Fuel,
Yeah, so what's the building cost?
salaries.
Is the fuel there? Fuel's kind of interesting. It could go either way, actually. It's got an incremental and an operational cost. I'm sorry, and the third thing?
Salaries.
All right, salaries. So
Sleeping.
sleeping. What's sleeping cost?
Depends if you're paying the people to do it or not.
Yeah, good answer. Well, what else?
But you gotta keep the heat on or the AC
Yeah.
on, so it's comfortable.
Yeah, so it's got utilities, it comes with a building. So you probably want them sleeping near the call, right? So if you have a spread out response area, you have to have a bunch of stations, right? Okay, well, what else?
Everything costs,
Training, all right.
everything except for supplies and ambulance supplies.
Admin.
ambulance.
Oh, yeah, interesting. So the easier question to ask might be, what exactly is the incremental cost of doing an ambulance run? Because everything else might be a readiness cost. So what are those incremental costs?
Fuel.
Fuel,
Vehicle maintenance.
fuel, vehicle maintenance.
Personnel cost while they're on call.
All right, how much they cost while they're doing it?
Supplies,
Insurance.
insurance.
Insurance. Yeah, insurance. I mean, I'd lean to putting insurance in kind of a readiness cost, but I'm sorry, Brandon, what did you have? Medical supplies on that call. Yeah. So, all right. So everybody has given good answers and these are all reasonable. As we were going through them, did anybody think, I would put that cost in the other category? Or I don't think it's fixed. I think it's incremental. Anybody have that thought as we were kicking out this list? It's okay to say yes. It's okay.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. I appreciate that, Kim. Yeah, so the issue around these calculations is there isn't a right way overall, but there is a way that your organization does it. So how you break these costs up and how you capture them, and especially in an organization that's part of a larger organization that does other things. So I'm in a fire district where we also do fire prevention activities, and we also do response to fire calls. We would split some of these readiness costs over those areas. Some of you are in municipalities or county governments. How many things do county governments do? Yeah, hundreds, billions, thousands. Yeah, everything from the roads to the library to the liquor license to the ambulance service. There's all manner of things, planning and zoning, owning, all of those things come into play. So yeah, if you are part of a large organization, anybody you just have like a general overhead allocation for HR services, IT services, finance that comes from anybody else? Anybody got that arrangement? Interesting. In a small special district like ours, we do a lot of those things in-house. I've got a budget line for them. When I spent time in a county government, I got a bill every year that said, here's how much fleet services cost you. Here's how much the county attorney costs you. Here's how much the finance office costs you. Here's how much the HR support costs. So in some cases, these can be a line on your budget. In other cases, they can be an allocation that comes from a parent organization or something along those lines. And in every case, they're kind of negotiable. So, I mean, is what kind of cost it is and how you account for it is really very much a choice. And in some cases, those costs are shared, and in some cases, those costs are just yours. So any other examples come to mind of a shared cost anybody has with?
Concept.
Oh, yeah, who's paying a fee for that? I am. Anybody else paying for a comp center? Cool. Yeah, ours is based on an allocation based on call volume multiplied by how much people talk on the radio divided by what we had to pay to fix the tower site, multiplied by some other factor I don't know. But yeah, a lot of folks have those types of arrangements. Pi, yes. Or is that pi r squared? But that's geometry, not economics. So we'll
Pi are round.
yes, pi are round and often yummy. For everyone online, we have gone off on a complete tangent that has nothing to do with the presentation. Thank you for sticking with the pi. All right, so how do you divide those out? So there are a lot of ways to approach that. Who's been doing the Medicaid supplemental reporting? Who's going down that road this week? I did mine earlier this week. It's like super fun, big spreadsheet. Got to figure out how to plug things in. You know, sometimes it takes it, sometimes it doesn't. But that is essentially a long way around to a cost per call calculation, right? Because at the end of the day, it will know how many calls and or transports you had, how many of those were Medicaid, and it will create a per call amounts. So that's a pretty typical way to do it, and that's got two permutations. One is cost for every call, the other is cost per transport. Why would I want to do transport instead of all of my calls as my
Transport's the only one that.
That's my
pays.
denominator. It's the, yes, it is the only one that pays. That's an excellent answer. So yeah, it helps better understand that. I've also seen places do it by hour and by unit hours as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about those next. So, all right, so has everybody heard of the term unit hour? It's essentially you staff an ambulance that is available to do something for an hour of time. So the classic, who's got just an ambulance or just 24-hour ambulances out there? We only essentially staff a 24-hour ambulance every day, all the time. So in our case, we actually deploy 8,760 unit hours annually. And that is calculated essentially by the one ambulance times the 24 hours times the 365 days a year. Alternatively, if we're doing a 12-hour ambulance, it'd be one ambulance times 12 hours a day times 365 days a year, which would generate essentially half that, or 4,380 unit hours in a year. Is everyone ready for some math? All right, so this is the tail end of my profit and loss statement for the Crested Butte Fire Protection District for last year. It's a super handy number because it's essentially $3 million is what our expenses were. So if I had 800 calls a year, who can tell me my cost per call? And how did you arrive at that figure? 800 calls per year, $3 million in expenses.
Big cost per call. It's almost $4,000.
So everybody's getting in the neighborhood of $3,750 a call. Yeah, that does seem like kind of expensive, doesn't it? I hear it should only be 900. Is that true?
Yes. Should.
So, all right, but I've only got 400 of those are transported because I just included all my fire calls and a bunch of other stuff that there's no payation on. So how much is it then on a cost per transport basis?
7,000.
Yeah.
50.
Yeah, about 7,500. All right. All right. So how much is it per hour to have that ambulance ready to go? Yeah, about 342 bucks. And as I told you, I only produce essentially one ambulance all the time. So my cost per unit hour is essentially the same as our cost per hour. So that'd be 342. The Grand County calculation is probably a little different. So how many 24-hour ambulances, any 12-hour ambulances, extra ones on the weekend?
We had 424/7.
All right, I expect a unit hour number by the end of the presentation, Alan.
Okay, I'll work on that.
All right. It will be some number higher than 8,760 times 3 plus the not quite everyday units. So, yeah, so yours, I would imagine, is probably in the 30,000 unit hour range total-ish.
Probably.
Yeah. How about you? Ooh, Tom, how's it in Canyon City? All right. So it's a combination of 24s and 12s in Canyon City. So essentially that number per unit hour is gonna float, and you're dividing by however many ambulance hours you're producing. So yes, sir.
All of your examples have been for full-time staffing. How does a volunteer service do this?
Well, how does a volunteer service do this? Because this assumes full-time staffing. It's a good question.
Because if you only average 3 calls a week, you still got the ambulance 24/7, which is not staffed except for those 3
So
hours
the
per
thing
call.
that would move then in that arrangement is either my fixed cost or my incremental cost of the people. And is that cost for volunteers 0?
It does not seem to change. 0 is always 0. Yes.
Although have volunteers cost you nothing?
No, that's true. You have to train them. You may have a stipend.
Uniform.
Training,
Uniforms, et cetera,
stipend,
et cetera.
uniform. I'm just trying to keep up with this for the,
Although realistically, their cost per call is, I mean, you still calculate the same way. You just don't have the higher personnel cost you would have. So you still take the total cost, divide it by the 24 hours a day there is an ambulance available, and you still come up with a number.
for those of you in the room, Ruben was kind of stating it's really the same calculation. It's just kind of a change in a personnel cost, because the item is still being produced. It just has a much lower personnel cost associated with it. Is that a reasonable?
That's my thought.
Yeah, is that a reasonable way to say that? Okay. Well, how do y'all feel about that? See, for those of you online, there is nodding in the room. I would turn the camera around. So all right. So what that essentially takes us to then is that these calculations are probably the same, but what goes into these calculations might be different, and might be substantially different if I'm carrying full-time personnel costs. And those costs include what, like a hourly rate or salary, Well, what else is in there? Because employees only cost their hourly rate, right? Oh, there's more? Oh, there's benefits. Oh, yeah. How much is that health insurance piece if you provide it? That's like super cheap, right? That's like,
It's like $2.
$2,000-3,000 bucks.
yeah,
a
so,
month.
yeah, I have 20 full-time employees. We write about a $22,000 check every month to pay for health insurance on those folks. So, yeah, it's not a small number. What else is in there? Retirement benefits.
Like,
Yeah, the employer side of social security or the pension. So yeah, some big numbers, usually in the range of like 25 to 40% on top of the actual salary rate is generally included in that. So yeah, if you have a volunteer organization, that's a lot of that can just come out of the math and make it a lot cheaper. Have any of the volunteer organizations calculated your cost per call or cost per hour? Has anybody done that recently? Wants to share a number? It cost me $342, and I have expensive paid people who have a pension. All right. It probably costs the average volunteer organization less. So no, excellent question, Kim. Thanks for bringing that up. So, all right. Anything else on how to split up costs? Again, there is no absolutely right answer. There's the way you do it that makes sense. And understanding that number is key to not doing it wrong. When I started at one of the places I worked a number of years ago, how they set the prices was there were no calculations in the background about how much stuff cost us. It was like, hey, our 3 neighbors charge this. Let's pick a number in the middle. Anybody else use that approach? It was great, other than we weren't actually charging enough to cover the cost of the service, which we had a mandate to actually do. So that required a pricing change pretty quick. So let's talk about those. I'm sorry, I was on a toy theme when I built this. Anybody got any Fisher Price stuff? The Fisher Price factory was actually in the town next door to the one I grew up in. So I've got a soft spot for Fisher Price. It's long since moved to Asia, but it was cool back in the day. But anyway, so all right, how do we price something? So cost plus pricing. The reason, well, we just went through that whole exercise on how much something cost us. Is that one of the typical ways that folks approach pricing is to say, it costs me X, I will charge X plus something. So that's the cost plus approach. There's also the value-based pricing model, which we kind of, I mean, this is kind of weird in healthcare, but essentially that is what you think something is worth and you charge that. Can anybody think of a good example of that?
Concert tickets.
Concert tickets, yes. What else comes to mind? Software. I was thinking of, the streaming services as well. I'm like, yeah, Disney Plus is worth $8 a month to me. So yeah, I'll pay it. Does it cost them $8 to produce that? I have no idea. But can anybody think of a value-based approach in healthcare? Yeah, cosmetics could be. Yeah, it's not super common in healthcare. And if you want to be kind of mean to the industry, you would say, well, there's probably a side of the pharmaceutical industry that is cranking the prices on things. Because, if I need that end stage cancer drug, why wouldn't I charge $100,000 for it, right? Because you clearly need it, right? So there's that approach, but that's kind of a sideways example, and it comes with all sorts of baggage.
Could you make that argument in like a metropolitan area where, you have 10 different hospitals and I know that I need to have like, I don't know, I need to get an MRI.
Mhm.
And I go to each of the 10 different hospitals and say, what's my MRI gonna cost? And is that, each one of them has a different price, so they're kind of competing with each other on the price of their MRI, or is that not bad?
If the market was anywhere close to actually rational and functional, that would probably be the case. And probably traditional healthcare, it's super hard to figure any of that out, right? Because I'm gonna go to the hospital, and what I pay for the MRI, there's a list price, but then there's an in-network price, and then there's another in-network price. So has anybody ever tried to call around to see what something at a hospital costs them? It's a super easy thing to figure out, right? Not usually. But I think what's closer to that traditionally is dental care, and veterinary care is often a lot closer to like a cash-based open market. So you'll probably see more of that there than in the traditional healthcare space, where there's a whole bunch of third-party payers. Speaking of third-party payers, there's a sticker on that car that you bought, right? And it says something called the MSRP. What is that?
Manufacturers suggested retail.
That's the manufacturer's suggested retail price. And we're in kind of an interesting market space right now where people are actually paying that number. But do people usually pay that number? No. Not if they can help it. And the other way to approach that is a concept, it's called keystone pricing, which means I'm anchoring my price off of something else. And I think that this is pretty typical in our world, right? Because what are you always curious about before you set your price? Who else's price? Rhymes with Medicare. So Medicare pays a certain amount no matter what. And so a lot of us are setting our pricing based off that amount of money. There's also a concept, and it's not common in healthcare too, where we'll take a loss on one piece of the business in order to make money in another piece of the business. Any idea how that applies to our world?
Taxpayer decreases or improvements.
And the first one that comes to my mind, and it's changed a bit over the years, is air ambulance, right? Because back when I started in the business in the 90s, hospitals owned air ambulances, a bunch still do. And they would actually lose money on the helicopter part because of why?
They were getting the critical patients.
Right.
To the hospital.
Yeah, and then the answer is they could fly somebody into their hospital and then make money off the 3, 4, 5, or 6 day hospital stay. Any other examples come to mind?
This might be more bundled, but I've seen where EMS agencies know they're not gonna make any money from the payer on the trip, or the mileage, but they know that they're gonna make it on supplies. And they boosted their supplies and are actually itemizing supplies. Actually,
And who's and I think that's an interesting question, and it does take us into the bundle piece. So how many folks in the room are actually doing their entire ambulance run as kind of a bundled price, a base rate, just a base rate and mileage? Let the record reflect for those online that a large majority of the room raised their hand. Who is not bundling? So on a hospital bill, are those bundled or unbundled? Unbundled in a lot of cases. So why are ours generally bundled? Does anybody know the answer to that question?
Because we're a supplier, not a provider. We're viewed the same as the people that sell toilet paper in the hospital.
And Ruben brought up again that we are a supplier of transportation services as opposed to a provider of healthcare services, which is actually a brilliant hot button to touch on. Yeah, a lot of it goes to the negotiated rulemaking piece with Medicare. Medicare does not care to have itemized charges, and they, by the force of law, can say thou shalt bundle. So then it becomes expedient for us to say, the heck with it. If that's how they want it, I'll just do that for everybody. And it seems like a lot of people have done that. Is it possible to unbundle ambulance charges? Yes. Is it possible that commercial payers will pay unbundled amounts? Yes. Are there downsides to that? Yes, because a lot of the commercial payers try to follow the public payers. So it's kind of a catch-22 on that front. And that's what I think I was interested in kind of talking about in terms of the bundling and unbundling. So thanks for the lead in. Anything else on pricing strategies? Let's move on to the next one.
Trying,
Thank you.
there we go.
There we go. All right, so other factors that influence price. Who charges a BLS rate? All right, a lot of folks. Who charges an ALS rate? A lot of hands. Who charges a specialty care transport rate? A few less hands. All right, so who here who charges a BLS rate also sends out a BLS ambulance? No hands go up. One hand in the room goes up. So a question around the level of service that certainly I've wrestled with and others have in the past is, so if all I have is a ambulance that's got an EMT and a paramedic on it, does that vehicle cost me the same amount of money every time it goes out the door? Does it cost me the same amount of money every time it goes out the door? Yes, but I'm charging a high rate or a low rate. Does that seem to make sense empirically?
Well, I think it makes sense from the standpoint that, you know, you can have an ALS ambulance and a BLS ambulance and
Right.
send the appropriate one for the call, but you don't really know which one's appropriate until you get there.
Right,
So as part of your readiness, you're sending an ambulance that could cover all situations.
although sometimes I can only bill it at the lower level,
Agreed.
right? Okay, so the one thing I've seen done, and I'm curious if anybody else does this, well, we did this for a while. Does anybody have the exact same ALS and BLS rate? I worked at a place that had exactly the same rate. And our logic was, it's exactly the same ambulance, doing exactly the same thing. So what that translated to was Medicare got either the BLS or the ALS rate coded, but it was the same amount of money and they pay what they pay. But the commercial insurers would potentially pay either of those amounts. And our BLS rate was, you know, insert an imaginary number, $1,500, and our ALS rate was $1,500. And sometimes the private insurers paid more. So how do you analyze your ALS versus BLS situation? And there was a question, Aaron, in the room.
So wouldn't an ALS ambulance, sending an ALS ambulance that has a paramedic and EMT on it, cost more than sending a BLS ambulance that has 2 EMTs on it?
Yes, if you do it that way. So repeating the actual question, is an ALS ambulance that has a paramedic and an EMT on it more expensive than 2 EMTs on a BLS ambulance? And the answer is yes. So there's probably a rational argument that the BLS rate should be cheaper if there are just EMTs, right? And a question to ponder is, if it's the same ambulance either doing an ALS thing or a BLS thing, should it be the same or a different rate? It clearly has to be coded correctly for Medicare and they'll pay what they feel like paying you, but could you have the same number? I've seen it work. So that's the level of service question. How many of you have a board of directors or county commissioners or a city council that you report to? They have an interest in the amount of money you charge for ambulance services and react poorly when the number is too high. Is that a reasonable statement? So governing bodies clearly have an influence on what we charge. We've already kind of talked about the public perception adventures of our ambulance rates. I don't see Tim in the room. He charges a pretty high rate. I was gonna ask him what kind of great comments he gets back on his ambulance bills. But I'll do that if he pops back in the room. So the likely payment amount's a big deal too, right? So Tim, how much does your organization charge as a base rate?
It's right around $1,925 is the base rate.
Tim's answer is $1,925. And how does your governing body react to that?
They're supportive of that.
He says his governing body is supportive. How does the general public feel about that?
They're okay with it because of our tax support. Because the advisory opinion from the OIG has said that taxes paid can be considered in lieu of payment of deductibles and co-pays.
Right.
So our district residents don't get balanced billed for those amounts not.
Excellent. And we'll talk a bit more about that, but it sounds to me like Tim is making his public a good deal and his governing body is okay with it. So does Tim have a good price? It is entirely possible that Tim has a good price. All right, so other factors to consider. What are you likely going to actually get paid is also a consideration. Medicare again drives that. And what others around you are getting paid also drives what a lot of the commercial insurers paid. Prior to negotiating rulemaking, Medicare did that as well, but then they changed that up when they went to the negotiated process to kind of a flat rate that's got like the rural modifier and the other things. Essentially, when the state division of insurance looks at how much people are paying for things, they too are looking at those comparative rates. And we've seen a lot of that analysis done when the surprise billing legislation has gone through, as well as when Medicaid tries to figure out how much they're paying. Here's a slight aside. Anybody know how Medicaid actually picks their rates while we're talking pricing?
Dartboard.
Dartboard was one suggestion. Any other options? Random numbers is another option. So if you put a couple beers in the Medicaid people, they'll actually tell you the answer. And the answer is actually fairly simple. They pay as much, well, they pay as little as they can to the people who squeak the most. So Medicaid is a never-ending exercise in who is yelling at me today and what is the least amount of money I can get them to stop yelling at me tomorrow. And that's generally how they approach the world. So, and I would be curious if Tim has an opinion on if that's an accurate statement or not, but he just walked out of the room. So, Tim is laughing. Tim is laughing. So that's generally how Medicaid approaches things. And then based on her payer mix, that's going to drive a lot too, right? So if I'm only getting these less than my cost Medicaid payments and my not quite my cost Medicare payments, that's going to drive me to have probably a lower number than if I've got a lot of commercial payers. So all of those things kind of go into the mix. So any questions on the stuff that influences price?
Yes.
Tim, go ahead.
How does the cost of uncompensated care fit into this?
What's the cost of uncompensated care fit in? So those are the folks that aren't paying you for the work that you did, right?
Correct.
All right, so how
And
does,
to be also considered your contractuals.
right, and the contractuals are essentially, I charge X, Medicare pays me Y. The difference in between X and Y is my contractual. Or I agree with some insurance company to take their prompt payment for 5% off, or however that works out. All of those things kind of fall into contractual. Yeah, I think we should answer that question. So how would you account for a certain chunk of people not paying you? Or not paying you, you're the full amount.
Hire an enforcer.
Hire an enforcer, that's one option. Easier, perhaps easier in New Jersey than in Colorado.
Raise the
Um,
price on those who do pay.
Raise the price on those that do pay.
And what's that called?
Cost shifting.
I believe that is called cost shifting, yes. So that's another big piece of the price that you want to think about, right? Is who's gonna pay you? And that goes to the payer mix part, right? Who's gonna pay you and how much are they gonna pay you? So it's essentially exactly that calculation, which is probably an estimate, right? But certainly something what we had to factor in. Did you have a comment over there? No, all right. All right, so. But that's how to price your ambulance service. Who thinks they've got the cheapest rate? Who's got a good deal, low base rate? Anyone? Anyone want to throw out a number? Anyone online want to throw out a number? We are in search of the least expensive base rate.
Nothing online.
All right, I'll start with mine. It's about $1,150. Can anybody beat my $1,150 on the low side? $1,000 from our good friends in Cheyenne County, right? All right, $1,000. Anybody can go under 1,000?
There's an ambulance service in Elbert County that charges $200.
All right, $200 base rate in Elbert County. Anybody can beat that? All righty, so $200 will be our low end of the range. All right, who's got the highest rate?
I've got a 950 here.
950 online.
Let me
Excellent.
see, where's 950 coming from? Morgan County.
Okay, 950
And
in Morgan,
1225 in Summit.
1225 in Summit. Okay.
They were 19 something.
All right, who can beat 1225? Tim can beat 1225.
I think mine is around 1,900 something. I mean, I can tell you what my average bill is,
Okay.
but yeah, right around $1,925.
All righty, 1,925. All right. Anybody can beat that? 1925, going once, going twice, going 3 times. Okay, so we have a range from 200 to 1,925, throwing all of those factors into the mix. Are any of you now nervous that 200 might be a little cheap and perhaps a thorough analysis was not done?
Actually, there are ambulance services that charge $0.
There are ambulances that charge 0. And that choice is generally because of, and I know a lot of ambulance services in the eastern US who charge 0. Why is 0 a viable number? Yeah, either I'm getting it all through taxes or I've made a choice as an organization that serves the community that I'm not gonna do health insurance billing. And then that could be either an administrative choice or just a policy choice that that's not how we serve our community. And that's certainly common. So yeah, well, we're looking at 0 to, $2,000. And that's the kind of range that you get, all based on this individual analysis of how much it costs, what factors are going in, who thinks what, and how to take it from there. So that's pricing. That's the long way around to why there is so much variability. Any additional questions I can answer on pricing?
You know, one thing I would also add in for our county at least is some geopolitical things that rise the cost. In other words, we have such a large county, in order to have ambulances staged in some of those distant areas, we staff more ambulances than our call volume would justify. So that's going to change your cost per call.
So the geography that you're covering and the number of stations that you have, particularly the stations that you have in places that don't get a very high call volume, are definitely a driver of that base rate. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a reasonable item. Sir?
And I'm sure this will come up later, but ET3 and, no transport, treat in place. Absolutely. That would probably fall under the whole service, but.
Yes, I think my colleagues in the afternoon are going to hit on that a bunch, but yeah, that's clearly a piece of that multiple revenue pie, right? So if I'm doing more than just ambulance transports, how do those other revenue streams fit in? And how do those play out? I think is an excellent point. Other items? All right. All right, so let's cover a few other side topics then. Well, one more slide if you would, sir. All right, insourced versus outsourced. It seems like we had a mix of that in the room. So who is in-house in the room? Why? That's what we were told. Good answer.
We were told outsourcing would cost more than what it is for the.
Okay.
It's better customer care.
Yep. So the comments in the room are outsourcing would cost us more. The other comment in the room is customer service is improved because you have essentially control of the whole process. What else? I've got a few of them on the slide here as well. I think a lot of times when I've seen insourced operations, that there really is a math equation there. And that math equation is how much does it cost me to have enough people with enough expertise, with enough ongoing training to actually do that in-house? When I was with Summit County a number of years ago, that number was about $250,000 in terms of how many people we needed to have. And they needed training because this is a complex game with a lot of rules. So there was sending them off on a regular basis to keep up on that training. You also have to have infrastructure in terms of software to process those bills. And so at the end of the day, a billing operation has a cost. And picking a number out of the air at that time, it was about $250,000. So what that means is if I outsource and it costs me more on a percentage basis than $250,000, I should keep it in-house. And if it isn't going to cost me $250,000 to outsource it, should I think about outsourcing it? Probably. And yeah, other reasons too are, yeah, local jobs, again, a lot more ability to control and coordinate a single point of contact. So yeah, it just costs a lot of money to have it in place, but especially if you have the volume, it gets incrementally cheaper. So that's insourcing. Outsourcing, who outsources? Why?
Part of it is the staffing and the cost of compliance. Having additional eyes, making certain that you're charging, which is not necessarily charging, but like medical necessity and all that stuff. There's a value to compliance.
All right, so staffing, cost of compliance, administrative hassle. Okay. What other thoughts on outsourcing? Well, why it's a good idea? Expertise. Is it kind of harder to have control of that process? Did you ever get those calls if you are outsourced about how the billing company was mean to me? I got one on Monday. Happens all the time. Well, it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens, you know, it happens from time to time is probably how I want to phrase that. All right. And then is it really truly outsourced or is there a bunch of in-house work?
Some you still do in-house work.
Yeah, there's still in-house work, right? Those calls still got to be done correctly. They still got to be recorded. So even though you're paying a percentage to have somebody else do the work, there is probably a chunk of work that you're doing in-house that is not part of that percentage. So how do you calculate that in? Kim?
Does the outsource option, do they have a built-in incentive to work a little harder at it? Like to rebill and instead of just taking, well, the insurance company paid this, I guess we're done with that one.
What's everybody's sense of that? I mean, I don't have a sense of that day to day from our billing company, but I think that's a reasonable theory. Does anybody?
I think it depends on your billing company.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we recently had to have a meeting where we were talking about some of that. The biller said, well, we can try and bill that, but they'll probably kick it back and we'd have to appeal and that's a lot of work. And our response was, well, that's your job. I expect you to appeal it, so chop chop.
So the answer to the question of, does the billing company have more or less incentive to do certain types of work is, and here's, all right, here's the answer that a $30,000 MBA gets you. It depends. So yeah, I think the answer kind of varies, and that's a company by company kind of specific question, but it's surely a question that is worth asking and understanding. So yeah, other thoughts on in versus out? Sir?
Yeah, I attended a conference with PWW and it was interesting. They said with outsourcing billing, many agencies think that they're outsourcing liability and that they're not, because ultimately the payer is paying, whether it's Medicare or
Right.
whatever, they're paying the agency through the outsourced billing.
Oh,
And they're in fact liable for any type of fraud or any type of issues that the billing service could have actually done.
so that's like super interesting then, right? So that means if somebody is billing on your behalf, you're still on the hook for doing it right.
Exactly.
So that means you also have to ask a bunch of questions around how are you in, how do you as our contractor make sure you're doing it right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious question.
Yeah.
So, other thoughts? All right. Well, that's in versus outsourced. Anybody here participate in network arrangements? It's not super common in a lot of places, but anybody have like contracted deals with, you hear the local Blue Cross carrier or United Healthcare or any of those folks? Anybody? None in this room. I'd be curious if anybody online does. Ruben probably has some. Yes, no.
We have some, not necessarily specifically with the insurance companies, but we have some contracted things with like our PACE organization
Mhm.
and our hospice organizations.
Okay, so kind of other payers you have contractual arrangements with.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, of course, hospice and PACE are both essentially, they get all their money from Medicare, but they're ACOs.
Right.
And then they subcontract with us for various services.
Why don't ambulance services generally participate in these types of arrangements? Because we'd get hosed. That's a decent answer.
Because they pay Medicare rates plus a small percentage.
Because they don't pay much, we get hosed and they don't pay much. So a couple of things to think about here just in general. Why would anybody sign up for this? Well, why would anybody sign up to be part of a preferred provider network?
Call it quick pay.
So yeah, the reason your doctor's office signs up is so they can get more patients and get paid quicker. Do we get to pick our patients?
No.
Do they get to pick us? Not really. And do we get paid? And so the real question on our end is getting paid quicker worth offering a pretty big discount? And who do you think in the EMS world says yes to that? Privates probably. I'd be curious if Tom has an opinion on that. But the ones in this state who clearly do are no. Is that a no from Tom? That's a no from Tom. All right.
I think they go around it a different way. The privates will do like a membership.
Right. Yeah, like a membership or a subscription program.
Yeah.
There actually is one sector that does this all the time. One of my neighboring EMS agencies is one of them. And some of the largest in the state are some of them. They're the ones owned by hospitals. Because hospitals already make these arrangements. They're already negotiating. But they have already got this laundry list of how much that they charge insurer X and insurer Y and insurer Z. So hospital-based ambulance services are generally the biggest users of this networking piece because it's simply easy to incorporate into the work they already do. So it's happening at Denver Health, it's happening at UC Health, And it is happening at the Gunnison Valley Hospital just adjacent to me. So those are generally the folks who do that kind of work because it's just easy to include it. So, all right. And then the other piece too, and I'm curious how this will drive it in the long term. And it's kind of just an aside question. We're seeing a lot of surprise billing legislation now, people trying to actually shut down the kind of large bills that are out of network. There's probably been some abuse in this area that certainly a lot of the big payers are kind of paying attention to. So I think as we see more and more pushback against surprise billing, is this going to drive more and more of us into making these kind of arrangements? I don't know, but it's a question I've got on my mind. So
We do have some questions.
Sure.
Whenever you're.
yeah, let's do it.
First question is, what are the factors in the different rates for BLS versus ALS?
So I think there's two sides to the factors involved in BLS versus ALS rates. The one side of it is, what is the difference in your organization? In some organizations, it may be a completely separate ambulance with a completely different set of equipment on them with a different crew on them. And that drives that question. In other organizations, those things are not different, and that would drive a conversation about maybe that price should be the same. I think that's the supply side of that. On the demand side of that, I think clearly Medicare drives a higher rate for one and a lower rate for another, and a lot of people follow along with what Medicare does on a private insurance side. So I would say those things. So.
Okay, and the next question is, you stated you could charge the same for ALS versus BLS. We currently do a BLS, ALS1, ALS2, and critical care. Is it possible to get rid of the BLS and ALS1 and only charge ALS2 and critical care? And with that question, I'm still unsure of the difference between charging BLS versus ALS1 versus ALS2.
Yeah, and I should clarify that a little bit too, right? So you have to code the call appropriately. So if you provide a BLS level of service, you have to kick out a BLS code on that bill. If you do ALS1, ALS2, specialty care, those you have to provide the code that matches the care that the patient receives. The piece that can either change or be the same is the price that comes at the end of that. So I don't know that code's off the top of my head, but the BLS code can be $1,500 and the ALS1 code can be $1,500 and the ALS2 code can be $1,500 and the SCT code can also be $1,500, and I would have the same charge for everything. I've got to code it correctly, but what I charge stays the same. That's where that flexibility exists. And certain payers will pay you what they pay, regardless of what price you attach to it.
So I think maybe, at least the way I was interpreting part of that question was, if I'm sending a medic on every car, why can't I just charge ALS every time?
Because you're legally bound to match the code for the service you provide to the actual service. So it's really only the price that you put at the end of it that can be the same or different. The services have to match the code.
You might see if that answered questions.
Yes, I would be curious if that did answer the question. So, other questions? And we'll just stand by for some. So just some general policy stuff as we're kind of cruising to the end here. However it's done, do it consistently, because there's no easier way to get in trouble than to actually not bill and collect consistently. And if the Medicare people are interested in taking a close eye at what you do, they are very much going to want to know that you're making reasonable collection efforts in a consistent manner, and the failure to do so is a problem. You'll want to avoid discounting below the Medicare rate in general. And in the slide set there is the link. If you actually go to the American Ambulance Association Medicare rate calculator, there's put in your zip code and find out what the Medicare rates are in your area. That's a free service. And then if you're writing off bills, have a consistent procedure for that as well. Even if that procedure says an individual will make a case-by-case determination, write down that process. And obviously all of the Medicare anti-kickback statutes is about don't give somebody a discount in order to get more business from them. That is the big red flag in the compliance side of the world. So, and I'm not a legal expert, so I was just going to gloss over those. And I suspect others may have a bunch more opinion on that in other parts of the session. All right, so it's about time to wrap. We got about 5 minutes left here. And there's a question.
Actually, this is a kind of a thank you. That did answer the question, and if I'm thinking correctly, I could change my base rate to X dollars, and it would be the same for BLS and ALS1, but when we code it, it would be coded correctly, but with the same rate.
Had I said it that succinctly the first time, we'd have been done by now. So yes, that's exactly correct. All right. So who does not bill local residents? Who does not bill local residents? Let's go with at all. Anybody not send a bill to local residents?
Is that something that would happen like in Baca Crestone?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, I think, so there's kind of a carve out in that anti-kickback statute I just referenced that says, if you are a public agency and you view tax money as part of or all of the patient side of the payment, that's deductibles and copays, that's legitimate. How you do that is a choice. You can choose to say, that's somebody in my zip code, I'm not sending them a bill. You can choose to say that that's somebody in my service area, I will give them a discount of X amount of money. Our organization says, I appreciate your tax payments, but I'm not willing to give your insurance company a break. So what that means is I will run you through the system right up until the point that the insurance company pays what they're going to pay, then we write you off. So there's a bunch of ways to approach that. There are some ways that aren't any good, that the Office of the Inspector General has frowned upon, and that's things like, in order to get the ambulance contract in my city, you have to give my city employees a free ambulance ride. That does not go over well. But if you have a consistent way to identify and discount people who are otherwise paying taxes or fees, there are ways to actually do that. Consult your attorney for the specifics of your particular situation. So, and in our case, it's super helpful, right? I think I hear a lot around town, those people were so nice not to, you know, to write off my ambulance bill after my insurance paid. Or in some cases, they have no insurance and I just write off their ambulance bill and they think that's pretty cool too. And I'm sure Tim's situation probably varies slightly. I know Grant County does a discount arrangement of a flat amount. So there are all sorts of ways to pull that off, but it is allowed in certain situations if done correctly. So yeah, otherwise, and then just writing bills off in general, again, it's about consistency and having a process for that. The only thing I'm going to end with is the health information exchange piece. Has anybody heard of QHN or COREO? All right, 2 people in the room. Yeah, east side of the state is COREO, west side of the state is QHN. Has anybody else in the room heard of crowdsourcing as a concept? QHN and COREO crowdsource the insurance card. So if I'm a doctor's office, and in our case it's QHN, or if I'm a hospital, or if I'm a specialist in the QHN system, the last place I flashed my insurance card, that's what's in the system as the insurance information, which means the most recent place any healthcare provider in the network saw it, if I'm a member of the network, I can pull that insurance information and it's about as current as it gets. That's not the same as getting the hospital face sheet, which is what, them having shown up 4.5 years ago with a different insurance card that spends half your life trying to figure out how wrong it is and why. So we have gotten a ton of benefit out of getting a login for our outsourced billing company to log into QHN and see what insurance information they have and how current it is. And I believe that Corio's got that same opportunity as well. So I would strongly recommend, in our case, it costs like $75 a month, I think, is our QHN membership, and it varies based on who accesses how much and what, but it's a great way to chase down current insurance information. And I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that as one of the last things I said. So with that, anything else I can clarify, unconfuse, make different?
Grant County's 42,528.
42,000 unit hours in Grand County, Colorado. 8,760 of those in Kremling that cost too much and run no calls.
That's excluding our specialty. Like for rodeo standbys.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks, Alan.
So
Appreciate it.
instead of listening, he was figuring it out.
All right, cool. Any other questions I can answer? I think we're getting on lunch. All right. Thank you for your time and attention and dealing with my Legos.